So our next speaker, Wendy Cukier, or shall I say, at Cukier Wendy. And for those of you who aren't on Twitter and are intimidated by it, Richard Denton, are you in the audience? Are you on Twitter, Richard?
Yes.
Right. So I helped Richard join Twitter a few months back. How long did it take, Richard? About a minute?
Yes.
Yeah, good. And it's really easy. All you need is your email address and your name, and you need to create a little handle, which could be your name, and then you're good to go. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our next speaker. Wendy Cukier, when I was speaking to her earlier, clarifying that I had the right biography for her, she said, oh, well, yes, but it's a little bit long. And I said, oh, yes, I know what you're saying, Wendy. I mean, I sometimes find it, a little bit awkward, the being modest when you're introduced with, such a long biography with somebody who's as accomplished as Wendy. And she said, no, it's not about modesty. I just don't want you to cut into my time speaking. And so without further ado, I'm going to allow her that opportunity to go right to speaking. But just let it be known that there are many accomplishments and awards here. Just some of them that I wanted to mention are that she's co-founder and president of Coalition for Gun Control, an alliance of over 300 organizations committed to preventing gun death, injury, and crime. She's authored numerous books, spoken in many countries, advised many countries, and has quite the list of accomplishments here. Most recently, she'll be the incoming president of Brock University starting in September. So without further ado, Wendy Cukier, thank you.
Well, after Ira's speech, I'm not sure if I just want to pull the covers over my head or run out and become an advocate for the prevention of nuclear war. But I'm here to talk a little bit about small arms and firearms, and I'll try to be fairly brief because I know lots of you will have questions. And some of this comes, I did a book with Vic Seidel, who was famously president of IPPNW many years ago. And so I'm very grateful to IPPNW and Physicians for Global Survival and many of the healthcare organizations represented in this room for picking up on the issue of small arms and firearms in a global context and its importance from a public health perspective. And certainly when we were working on regulation in Canada and also through the International Action Network on Small Arms, IPPNW was very, very active. And in some ways on this issue, I think as with the nuclear weapons issue, we celebrated a lot of success in the a decade or so ago, and we've seen much of that eroded. And the challenges today, even in a country like Canada, are as great as they've ever been. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about global gun violence from a public health perspective. I'm not going to talk about all of the causal factors that shape violence generally, or gun violence in particular, but I am going to focus on the accessibility thesis and why people are concerned about the instrument of violence rather than simply the broad causal factors or other interventions. Just a few words about the politics of gun control, because I think one of the real challenges that we face on this issue and many other public health issues is that the evidence is pretty clear. But the political will is simply not there, and the opponents' invested interests, who are resisting what most people would consider to be rational policy, are much more vocal, are much more active than those who support effective regulation. So I'll talk a little about that. I mentioned in my talk earlier today that it was really organizations like IPPNW, the International Committee of the Red Cross, WHO, and so on, that put weapons, and particularly small arms, firmly in the space of public health. and advocated using a public health approach to addressing the problem of violence generally and gun violence in particular. And I mentioned this earlier today. What's interesting about the global statistics on gun violence is that more people are killed with firearms in contexts that are considered to be peaceful than are killed in conflict zones. And that's important because with this issue, as opposed to the nuclear weapons issue, there are what many countries have deemed legitimate purposes for small arms and firearms. And therefore, the regulation of them, or risk reduction, is really the approach that most take. There are some who would simply say ban all guns, but their success in implementing such positions has been quite limited in countries around the world. There isn't a lot of success with movements that have focused on banning guns altogether. And ironically, the regulation of any dangerous object in many respects is much more complex than efforts to regulate it. So it's a different challenge in some respects than the focus on nuclear weapons, although there are some parallels and similarities. Just to put it in context, when we started working on this issue, in Canada, 1,400 Canadians were killed with guns each year, the majority of them in suicides, which is quite typical of most industrialized countries, the US being a notable exception. And what I want just to draw your attention to is the precipitous decline we've seen, not just in firearm deaths, both the absolute numbers and the rates, but certain kinds of firearms deaths. So homicides with rifles and shotguns in particular in this country have fallen dramatically. And we can talk about the reasons, but there's pretty good evidence that increased regulation has played a role. When we look at the causal factors, of course, everybody recognizes that you have to address the root causes of violence and structural issues, which we'll talk about more. But the focus on the firearm is really tied to this notion of harm reduction and the reduction of lethality. So, of course, people can attempt suicide with a variety of means. When a firearm is present, 93% of the suicides will be completed. And it's part of the explanation about why rates of suicide are much higher among men, because they're more likely to use firearms. Similarly, if we look at the context of violence, we see that countries which have similar rates of assault and violence generally, the UK and Canada, for example, would be an apt comparison, have radically different rates of homicide or lethal violence, largely because of the availability of firearms. We also know that in a healthcare context, treatment options are, of course, important, and some factors which influence fatality rates are, access to emergency services and so on. But most of us, I think, would agree that the focus on prevention is where we want to put our energy. This is a disappeared slide, so I'll just move on to talk generally about some of the comparisons that we see on an international level. And there's been a fair amount of research in industrialized countries that looks at rates of availability of firearms and firearm death rates. And the most pronounced examples are when we compare things like the US and Canada and Australia. Someone raised the issue of Israel this morning, so I pulled up the data on that, and indeed Israel does have high rates of gun ownership. It also has high rates of gun death. If we look at things like domestic violence, and domestic violence is a really important phenomena in spite of the fact that the numbers are often fairly small overall, but for every woman who's killed in the context of intimate partner violence, we know many more are threatened and injured. And we see, because femicide is tied very often to legally owned guns in the home, we see a very strong correlation between the availability of firearms and the murders of women. And this is from David Hemingway from the Harvard School of Public Health, who did a book called Private Guns, Public Health, which is one of the seminal pieces of work on the public health approach to firearms. It was WHO that argued that there are no simple solutions to complex problems, and when we look at the problem of violence, we have to consider factors at the societal level as well as the interaction between local factors and individual factors and their interplay. So even though my attention is focused on firearms, I certainly recognize the interplay between those factors. And this morning I talked more about culture of violence and definitions of masculinity and how those cultural factors drive demand for firearms. Today I'm going to focus more on legislative interactions and the role of regulation. As I said with firearms, the intent of regulation is not to prevent people from using firearms for legitimate purposes, which in this country include hunting, target shooting, and certain occupations, but to reduce the risk that guns will be misused. And part of the rhetoric around gun control is you punish criminals, not law-abiding citizens, focus on the illegal guns, not the legal gun owners. But that begs the question, where do illegal guns come from? Every illegal gun begins as a legal gun. So even if your preoccupation is street violence and illegal guns in the drug trade, you have to recognize that the regulation of legal guns is a key part of the solution. I would argue that a lot of the rhetoric around criminals and illegal guns and so on obscures the role of firearms in things like suicides, domestic violence, and even the murders of police officers. Typically in those circumstances, the guns that are used are legally owned. So when we look at legislation worldwide, particularly in industrialized countries where there's the infrastructure to actually implement the legislation and enforce it, we see that the biggest impact tends to be on the reduction of suicides and on the reductions in domestic homicide, but there are also impacts on the illegal gun trade. And there have been a number of examples of that. Won't talk about Canadian legislation, but certainly if people are interested, I can go into it in more detail. Canada is one of the few countries in the world that has seen its gun control legislation rolled back. Most countries are actually strengthening controls over firearms. And sadly, for those of you who didn't notice this, if you read the Liberal platform, they will say, "We will not create a new national long gun registry to replace the one that has been dismantled," in flashing lights. So those of you who thought sunny days were coming, think again. If we look at international agreements, there are many agreements Canada has been involved in negotiating and is either not a signatory to or has failed to ratify. And one of the most disgusting cases was the Arms Trade Treaty, which the gun lobby in Canada was highly active in, and Canada, as a result, was not a signatory, even though the United States was. The International Tracing Instrument, same thing. What's horrifying to me about this is when Canada reported on its progress at the United Nations, it referenced the firearms registry. And then the year later, it dismantled it and destroyed all the records. And it's interesting because lots of people talk about issues around the right to bear arms, both nationally and internationally. And what we've seen is consistently at an international level, both the Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and Small Arms, and perhaps even more importantly, the Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women, have repeatedly argued that under international law, countries have an obligation, not just a right, but an obligation to regulate civilian possession of firearms in order to keep their citizens safe. So when we look at the politics of gun control, as with other large issues, there is a political economy. There are many books that have been written that trace the influence of special interests, both the relationship between the industry as well as the gun lobby. The National Rifle Association is without question the most powerful lobby group in the entire world, and its influence is global. But the big problem, I would argue, in Canada as elsewhere, is not the opponents of gun control. It's the people who support gun control in principle, but do nothing. Because we know for sure, even in the United States, supporters of sensible gun control vastly outnumber the opponents. But the opponents will vote based on gun control, raise money based on gun control, torture their MPs or their members of the legislature based on gun control. And many of the supporters have other priorities. And I remember I was at one of the Counter G8 meetings that Amnesty organized, and it was a group about this big, and I said, how many of you support licensing gun owners? How many of you support registration of firearms? Yes. How many of you think we should ban military weapons? Of course. How many of you done anything about it? And they looked at their shoes. And what is more frightening, because it was a room full of young people, how many of you know the name of your member of parliament? Elicited a similar response. So the disengagement of people on this issue specifically, but political issues generally, I think is one of our biggest challenges. And it's a challenge for the Coalition for Gun Control. It's a challenge for any organizations working on progressive issues. The other thing people talk a lot about is Canada versus the US. The difference is not culture, it's not even public opinion. The point spread on most polling around gun control is relatively small. The difference is political structures, the lack of campaign spending reform, and the design of a government which is intended not to allow government to do anything. So if you look at the US, it's really important to understand most Americans support reasonable gun control. There are big differences when you start talking about banning assault weapons or banning handguns, but on regulatory frameworks, there are great similarities. Also, none of my pictures are showing. Anyways, this was a picture of me, very nice picture of me that had been used for target practice. And I was sharing it partly because Thomas said it would scare everybody. But I'm sharing it because it again reinforces that point I made earlier, which is that the opponents of gun control are very extreme in their views, but they are also highly motivated. And they scare politicians into submission. They scare some advocates, not me so much, they just make me mad, but even columnists who write supportive articles on gun control will find themselves targeted. And I think if you're not actively engaged in this issue, you may not have a sense of the intensity and the strength of the opposition. So from my perspective, this, like so many other issues that are challenging us today, is really a function of the fact that good people don't do enough. And I'm not referring to the people in this room, because many of you, individually as well as part of your organizations, have been very active on this issue. But in general, the problem with gun control in Canada, in the United States, in many countries in the world, is not that the average person does not want sensible legislation. It's that the opposition is very vocal and the supporters are not. And without question, there's a gender dimension to that, which plays out on many levels, including the power and the influence typically men exercise in political decision-making, whether it's at national government levels or at the United Nations. It will be very interesting to see if our new Sunny Days cabinet has influence on this issue and other issues. I wish I were more optimistic, but we really need more support and more engagement, and the mobilization of youth on this issue is going to be absolutely fundamental in terms of shaping our future. Thank you very much.